Welcome everyone to Fear of Returning, Part 3. I'm going to figure out how to share my screen here. There we go. Alyssa, are there any problems, or can everybody hear? Everything okay?
It looks good. Yeah, looks and sounds good.
Excellent. So this is our rescheduled webinar. Unfortunately, we had some internet trouble last week. Thanks for joining us this week. Back to school, so much has changed even just over the weekend since we prepared this webinar. Masks are now required for every student, which is completely new and different. It just reinforces how uncertain these times really are. I'm excited about this webinar because everyone's feeling uncertain. No one knows what will happen, but I can help you manage your response to uncertainty. My name is Marissa Bragg, founder of OCD North. In Barrie, Ontario, we treat obsessive compulsive disorder using exposure and response prevention. Alyssa, our clinic manager, is also on the line. She is managing the Q&A section of our webinar today, as well as the chat lines for all of our attendees. If you are using the chat, please make sure that you make it visible to everybody, because if you have a question, everybody probably has a question. So let's get it out in the open and talk about it. I wanted to let you know part 1 and part 2 are now up on YouTube. If you were part of part 1 and part 2, you have also been emailed some resources, and today you'll also be emailed some resources at the end of our webinar. This is for teachers, support staff, and administrators. Just a little Schitt's Creek humor. I watched the very last episode of season 6 last night of Schitt's Creek, and I just couldn't help but put in these memes. This actually came from a website talking about how parents and teachers are feeling about returning to school. So let's just get started with a little bit of humor and make it nice and light. When the government assures teachers and support staff they've got everything under control. When people say you should just quit teaching if you don't want to go back. So I can picture David saying, eat glass. Anyway, it's quite funny. When you just can't comprehend social distancing with 25 kindergartners. What does that mean? Okay, so here we go, into uncertainty, into fear, and how to cope with these things. Your school board has been vague with information concerning personal protective equipment, class sizes, and hand hygiene. Information is constantly changing. As I said, like last week, at the beginning of the week, masks were only required for older elementary and high school students, and now they're for everybody. You have the health of your family, children, and students to consider. You have what if questions like, what if I bring COVID-19 home? What if one of my other students brings it home? What if parents don't screen their kids? What if kids don't screen themselves? On the first day of school, what happens if 3 of your students don't wear masks? Students haven't seen each other since March, and they could be gathering together in groups, hugging and enjoying their return to, quote, normalcy. And I say, quote, normalcy because, school it's nice to get back to a version of normal. But what do you do as a teacher or as an administrator if that does happen? So I'm intentionally putting what if thoughts in your heads right now because I want you to think of a what if thought. For the purposes of this webinar, and you can use the comments section, you can use the Q&A. Let me know what some of your what if thoughts are. Or if you're not comfortable with the what if thoughts, or telling me what your what if thoughts are rather, think of them. what are some of your what if thoughts related to going back to school? I have like 10 off the top of my head. Once you've thought of your what if thoughts, count them. How many are there? By the end of this webinar, you'll know how to cope with the uncertainty and fear of going back. You'll be able to handle those what if questions. Here's how we deal with uncertainty. We call it out. Are you experiencing fear? If anybody is experiencing fear, we have what if questions associated with that fear. And we could go all day thinking about what if questions. So if you have 10 off the top of your head, you can probably think of another 30. But here's where we shift a little bit. For every what if thought, what is the alternative? So what if 3 of my students show up without wearing a mask? Scary thought, right? But what if all of your students show up wearing a mask? Well, there's a much different tone to that, isn't there? For every what if thought, there's an alternative thought. And dollars to donuts, I think I used that expression correctly. The alternative thought is much more likely than the what if thought. Let's start with number 1. Are you fearful? So how scared are you? And give that fear a number. The higher the number, the more fearful we are. Are you fearful about going back to school? Yes. Well, how scared are you on a scale of 1 to 10? I'm a 7. Okay, so that tells me that there's a lot of fear about going back to school. Can you talk to anybody about that fear? And the answer to this question is probably. I should throw in a caveat to that. Can you talk to anyone about it productively? We don't want to throw around fear like it's a ball. When I say, can you talk to anyone about it, we want a productive conversation. I'm not, looking to share what if thoughts with you. I'm looking to get a productive answer. I'm looking for an empathetic ear. Let's talk about my fears. Oftentimes when we talk about it, when we get those what if thoughts out of our head, or the fear talk out of our head, we can come back to a more logical, grounded place. So, if we express fear that, well, I'm afraid that in the first 10 minutes, I'm going to be touching so many surfaces that I'm going to have and touch my mouth. I'm just afraid that I'm going to contract COVID-19. Well, then I would ask you to, 1, think of the alternatives, but also, like, now that you're hearing that what if thought out loud, is it logical? Like, let's try to attribute some form of logic to these what if thoughts, because logic can oftentimes take the fear out of the thought in and of itself. So write the fear, productive conversation, and once we are able to talk about our fear or our what if thoughts, sometimes they sound a little bit ridiculous, and that's okay. That's what fear sometimes can give us, false signals that sound ridiculous when we say them out loud. And that's a good thing. That means that we can attribute logic to them. So I would encourage you to do that with anybody that you trust, not somebody who's going to bully you or make fun of you. Fear is a normal human emotion and response to a perceived threat. COVID-19 is not a perceived threat, it's an actual threat. But what we can do is cope with it in a logical way, in a productive way. We don't want to push it down. And this is normal. I mean, the reason we've been able to put on 3 webinars is because kids are scared, parents are scared, teachers, administrators, support staff. We're all scared. We don't know what to expect. We don't know what's going to happen. And so we need to do the best we can with the information we have. The best way to do that is to armor ourselves with a whole lot of tools. Okay, so back to our what if questions. I want you to bring to mind 1 or 2 or 3 what if questions. It would be helpful if they're related to back to school, but they might not be. So go ahead, I'll give you a minute. Think about a what if question. My what if question, and I'll use my example as we walk through this webinar. My what if question is, what if my kids get sick? And I'm going to use the term sick because we all know that that's code for what if my kids get COVID. But I don't like to use that slang, so I'm just going to say, what if my kids get sick? Okay. What's the likelihood of that what if coming true? So for your what if questions, if you have them written down, if you have them on the top of your mind, go through each what if question. What is the likelihood of that coming true? Again, higher the number, the more likely it is to come true. And so for my kids, if I'm afraid that they could get sick, I would look at the epidemiology. I would look at their class size and some of the pool of kids that they'll be going to school with. Are they going into big class sizes, small class sizes? I really don't like thinking about this right now. So I would say that the likelihood of my kids getting sick is probably a 5. So there's a 50% chance. Well, see, now that as I say it, that's not logical because my kids they're going to wear masks. We have to make sure that we know that PPE is going to be implemented. So, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. For the purposes of this slide, the likelihood in my mind right now, in this moment, before I apply any logic, is 5. There's a 5 out of 10 or 50% chance that my kids will get sick because of going back to school. Okay, moving on. Is it a 6 or above? Okay, I'm going to change that to a 5 or above for the purposes of this, this webinar. Okay, 5 or above, check. What factors can I control? Okay, here's where I said last slide I was getting ahead of myself. Okay, what factors can I control? Well, I can control that I screen them before they go to school every day. I can control if they wear a mask, at least going into school, and don't have surveillance cameras on them, but arguably, they're pretty good kids. They are not rebels. They will follow rules. So I know that they're going to be wearing a mask when they're not outside or eating. I know that they're going to sanitize their hands because I'm sending them to school with hand sanitizer. And it's just like, it's a little spray hand sanitizer. That's what I'm sending to school with them to keep in their backpack, along with another mask. I know they're going to use this stuff because I've talked to them about it. So I can control PPE. I can control that, as soon as they're getting in my car when I pick them up, that they're using hand sanitizer. I know that as soon as we get home, they're washing their hands. So that's what I can control. Now, I guess, in terms of for teachers, administrators, and support staff, the factors that you can control look probably a little bit different, but not all that different. Again, everybody's dealing with that uncertainty and that fear. So I think everybody is going to be a little bit hypervigilant. Teachers are going to have hand sanitizer, whether that's stuff that the board has provided or, we're all kind of carrying hand sanitizer now anyway. We're all going to have masks on, gloves if appropriate. So think about what factors you can control for this particular what if thought. Next up, let's do some planning, and we'll get into that next. Okay, well, look at that. I'm ahead of myself. Okay, so I want to put the positive tests sort of on a new slide here, but um, for teachers, administrative personnel, and support staff, we can control how we contribute to the school's protocol, and we can control how much of the protocol we enforce in our classroom or in our school, and we can control how much we are getting close to people. We, as teachers, for example, you can, set that boundary at the beginning of class, um, if at all possible. I'm going to show you some photos later of some creative classroom um, setups. But you can control your own social distancing. It might be easier for administrators and support staff, or it might be harder. But you can keep your distance. You can control how frequently you wash your hands. You can control when you're wearing your mask and when you're not wearing your mask. You can control how frequently you're screening. Um, Positive tests. What's your school's protocol on positive test results? Something that you can control knowing the answer to. Um, Not necessarily what happens next, but you can control your response to whether or not there's a positive test, and you can control how much you know about that protocol. Okay, so here are some classroom setups. You can see on the far left here a little grid, and the person that posted this image said there's only 4 feet between students, that social distancing isn't really possible in a classroom setting. Everyone's feeling uncertain. Nobody knows what's going to happen. There's a lot of fear when we look at this image because there's only 4 feet, there's not 6 feet. So what factors can we control in a classroom that we can't physically make bigger? Well, do you see how control was implemented here? The teacher took control and had herself deal with this fear by creating these lines. She can't control how well students adhere to these lines, of course, but she made her classroom as best as she could fit the guidelines. Now, she can also respond to how she deals with PPE. She could be wearing a mask, she could be sitting way over here, to make sure that she is physically distant from her students. The students may or may not be wearing masks, depending on where you are geographically in the world. So this is how one teacher is coping. This is how one teacher is kind of roping in her control of the situation, of her what if thoughts that could be, a 5 or greater. Top right, we see this quote unquote physically distanced classroom. So this is another teacher's, an older teacher's perspective on things here. Lost my cursor. I wanted to make Alyssa's name lower. Anyway, so for older kids, this is what they've done to cram as many kids as they can in a classroom while still maintaining quote physical distancing. And this is what that teacher could control. Again, that teacher can't control how the students respond to COVID-19, how they respond to PPE, but they can respond to how they want their classroom to look. And I want to also mention here that this sets precedent of what's expected on the first day. So kids and teens and learners in general are I shouldn't generalize, but this visual representation sets an expectation of, rules. I expect you to maintain your physical distancing. And it reinforces that we're taking this stuff seriously. So, we're dealing with uncertainty in that respect as well. On the bottom, we have the library markers all going in one arrow. And, in terms of conditioning, kids are really great at learning and learning quickly. Sidebar, I love treating kids that have OCD because they learn so quickly. So, in a school setting, if we set these expectations here, if we're going into our classroom and we're putting in effort and to make sure that PPE and the regulations are being followed, students are likely to pick up on that and likely to follow. We also maybe, could make sure that we have extra masks on hand. And I know that that might be at an expense to the teacher. But with that funding from the government, maybe it won't be. And maybe you teachers are sort of laughing at that right now with, that quote unquote extra funding. But having extra masks on hand is also a really good way to make sure that students follow the rules and the guidelines and the boundaries that you set in your classroom. If you have any students that require school support, having a conversation with that educational assistant, have an open conversation about fear, talk to them about how they're doing, make sure that you're supporting each other, and that everybody is on the same page in the classroom. Again, at the bottom right here, we see more of a lecture style classroom designed for social distancing purposes. Okay. There we go. So I wanted to put this in here, and Alyssa will email this out. These are where the photos came from, and there's many more examples on this website of how teachers are trying to create some socially distanced classrooms. Around the world, schools have had to deal with the return to school. And it's been done differently in different cultures. What we know for sure is that kids do really well when they are at school, socially, developmentally. What we don't know is what will happen when we go back to school. We don't know what will happen to the rates of transmission. We don't know any of that stuff. We don't know how, we have, I think, only 2 weeks before we go back. So a lot can change between now and then. It might even, I haven't checked the news since my today. So, maybe there's updates that this presentation is suddenly out of date. Information, like at the beginning of the pandemic, it's changing rapidly. Don't stay on top of it too much. Know what you need to know and know more. I like this saying, know what you need to know and know more. You don't need to give your brain more reasons to come up with what if questions. So really make sure that you're dealing with your what if questions on a logical in a logical way. So 5 or above on your fear scale. Okay, I can deal with that, right? And now that I say, we walked through my example with my kids going back to school and it was a 5, and then we talked about the factors that I could control. I said that fear out loud. It's not really a 5 out of 10 anymore. It's more like a 3. My kids are pretty awesome, and I know that I have a certain degree of faith in their school. I know that their teachers have things under control. And I know that everybody is feeling uncertain and everybody is feeling afraid. So I know that there will be other precautions taken into consideration. So anyway, I hope that you have received everything that you were hoping to out of this webinar. I hope that this helps you manage your response to uncertainty. Pay attention to those what if questions, rate them, talk about them, deal with them. Sometimes as we say them out loud, their power gets taken away with logic. And of course, some of our what if questions are logical, but talk about them. We will be sending you this webinar. It'll be posted on YouTube. And you can look forward to future webinars moving forward, hopefully in September. I'm going to get better at them as we go, I hope. And if our audience has any recommendations, anything they want to learn, please reach out, let us know. We are happy to put these on for our community. So thank you for your attendance. Reach out to us if you have questions, and make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe to our newsletter that comes out every month so that you can be up to date. Thanks, everybody.